Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. Here, I share real-life World War II stories, but just a heads up. All the visuals you see are created by me, so if some of them don't look perfect, I hope you'll forgive me. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Alright, let's dive into today's story.
The night sky was a canopy of black velvet pierced by stars that twinkled like distant fires. Somewhere below, the rolling fields of Normandy stretched in muted shadows, dotted with hedgerows and the occasional farmhouse whose windows glimmered faintly in the moonlight. Sergeant Daniel Whitaker gripped the straps of his parachute, every muscle tense, every nerve alert. The C-47's engines roared overhead, vibrating to the cabin floor. Around him, comrades shifted nervously, their breaths visible in the cold night air, the thump of boots and clatter of gear mixing with the metallic hiss of oxygen regulators. They were part of the 82nd Airborne, tasked with a mission that would decide the fate of an entire sector of the Allied invasion. Every detail had been planned, every contingency discussed, but no preparation could fully replicate the terror of jumping into the unknown. Daniel checked his gear one last time. Rifle secured, sidearm loaded, explosive strapped to his chest for sabotage missions. He listened to the low murmur of Captain Allen's voice, giving last-minute instructions, detailing rendezvous points, and stressing the importance of speed and stealth. "Remember," Allen said, "once you hit the ground, it's every man for his objectives. We have one shot at this. Stay alive, stay sharp." The hatch opened. Cold air slammed into Daniel's face, biting through his nerves and adrenaline alike. The roar of the wind drowned all thoughts except the single truth. Jump. He leapt. The world flipped. Stars blurred into streaks of light. The ground rushed toward him with a terrifying speed, hedgerows expanding, buildings growing larger with every heartbeat. The harness tugged against his shoulders, parachute lines snapping tight as the canopy deployed with a violent jerk. Daniel swung under the chute, the wind screaming in his ears, the faint glow of fires on the ground painting fleeting patterns across the landscape. Landing was brutal. His boots struck soft earth, then hedgerow roots, then hard stone. Pain shot up his leg, but he forced himself to roll, absorbing the impact as best as he could. Around him, others landed, some cleanly, others entangled in trees or hedges, their curses and grunts slicing through the night. Chaos descended. Daniel tried to orient himself. The jump had scattered his platoon across miles of terrain. Smoke drifted faintly from enemy patrols who had spotted the lights and muffled explosions from the coastal front. He moved silently through the fields, staying low, hugging the shadows, listening for the sharp clack of boots, the sudden bark of German orders, the distant roar of artillery. A patrol emerged, machine guns at the ready. Daniel froze, heart pounding. He flattened into a ditch. The soldiers passed within meters, unaware of the American paratrooper beneath the moonlit foliage. But luck ran thin. Another squad, alerted by distant noise, turned toward him. His escape route cut off. Daniel ran, stumbling through mud, barbed wire snagging his uniform, adrenaline and fear making him reckless. A sudden flare illuminated the field. His shadow stretched impossibly long. Movement overhead. Planes? No. Tracer fire. He heard a shout. "Halt!" Before he could react, a rifle butt slammed into his side, sending him sprawling. Hands grabbed him, twisting his arms behind his back. Pain flared. Cold iron cuffs locked around his wrists. He had fallen into enemy hands. The Germans were efficient. Daniel was dragged to the mud and hedgerows, boots slapping, rifle clattering behind him. His training screamed at him to resist, but he was outnumbered, exhausted, and alone. One of the soldiers spat near his face, muttering curses in guttural German. He was shoved into a waiting vehicle, a truck dark as pitch, the smell of oil, sweat, and fear thick inside. The engine rumbled to life, and they drove, twisting along narrow country roads. Daniel pressed himself against the wooden slats, calculating, observing. Every detail mattered. The number of soldiers, the terrain, the direction they were heading, potential escape routes. Hours passed. The vehicle stopped. Daniel was dragged into a building. The floor cold stone, walls echoing faintly with the voices of other captives. Guards barked orders. Hunger gnawed at him, but more dangerous was the uncertainty. Where was he? What had the enemy planned? He realized with cold clarity that the mission on which he had jumped now hung by a thread. His thread. Inside the building. Other prisoners of war stared at him with hollow eyes. Some whispered. Some sat silently, staring at walls as if trying to will themselves invisible. Daniel recognized the weight of fear in their posture, the same fear that clawed at his chest. He swallowed it, forcing himself to stand tall, to assess the plan. Escape had been possible. He had survived the jump, survived capture. He could survive this too. Outside, distant artillery pounded the countryside. The war had not stopped, and neither could he. His mind raced. Guard rotations, possible tools, enemy routines, weaknesses in doors, locks, and windows. The Germans might have him now. But survival was still a strategy, a calculation, a battle of patience and nerve. As night fell over the camp, Daniel whispered a promise to himself. He would not remain a prisoner. He would find a way. He would escape. And when he did, he would return to his mission, to his comrades, to the fight that had started with a leap into the darkness and would not end until victory was wrested from the chaos of war. The world outside the walls was still raging, but inside, Daniel Whitaker began the first steps of a journey that would test not only his courage, but every skill he had ever learned as a soldier. He had fallen into enemy hands, yes, but he had not yet fallen into despair. And in war, hope is the most dangerous weapon of all. The first hours of captivity were a blur of cold stone, harsh shouts, and the constant scrape of boots on the floor. Sergeant Daniel Whitaker sat on the damp ground of the holding cell, his hands still bound by iron cuffs, eyes scanning every inch of the room. Shadows clung to the corners, and the faint smell of sweat, unwashed bodies, and fear permeated the air. He could hear the faint murmurs of other prisoners, a chorus of hopelessness, broken occasionally by sharp commands in German or the metallic clatter of keys. Daniel's mind refused to still. Every soldier is trained to assess, to observe, to anticipate. Now, stripped of weaponry and separated from his unit, his training was the only weapon he had. He memorized the routines of the guards, the rhythm of their footsteps, the moments they paused to smoke, the soft creaks of the door hinges. He noted which guards were more vigilant, which ones were careless, and which paths might offer even the slimmest opportunity to slip free. A single guard approached, keys jangling, his face hidden in shadow. Name, he barked in accented English. Daniel gave it clearly. Sergeant Daniel Whitaker, 82nd Airborne. The man sneered and wrote something in a small ledger, the scratch of pen on paper loud in the otherwise silent room. Good, the guard muttered, and left, slamming the door behind him. Alone again, Daniel leaned back against the wall, flexing his aching wrists. Blood had already begun to pool where the iron had bitten into his skin. He traced the patterns of cracks in the floor, the small gaps between stones, the slight shift in the wall near the corner. Tiny irregularities, imperfections that might matter later. Escape, he realized, would depend on attention to detail as much as courage. Every imperfection was a clue, every pause in the guard's routines, an opportunity. Hours passed. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but more dangerous than physical deprivation was the mental toll. Captivity forces a soldier to confront fear on a level far beyond combat. On the battlefield, a man fights an enemy he can see. Here, the enemy was uncertainty, invisibility, the creeping dread that paralysis might take root. Daniel forced his mind away from despair. He began rehearsing scenarios, timing the guards, improvising lockpicks from bits of metal, moving silently across rooms, slipping into shadows. Every imagined escape reinforced his will to survive. By midday, Daniel was brought before an officer, a wiry German captain whose uniform bore the insignia of authority and experience. The officer studied him with calculating eyes. "Paratrooper," he said in accented English, voice cold and deliberate. "You are far from home. Tell me about your mission." Daniel met his gaze steadily. He had been trained for this. Information was a weapon, and he would wield it carefully. I was dropped behind enemy lines to sabotage communications," Daniel replied cautiously. He allowed only vague details, nothing actionable, Nothing specific. The captain's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing further, motioning for Daniel to return to the cell. It was a test, and Daniel had passed it. For now, back in the cell, Daniel allowed himself a brief moment to breathe. He traced the lines of his rifle in memory, remembered the weight of the M1 in his hands, the field grenades, the roar of planes above the drop zone. Combat had been straightforward in its danger. Captivity was far more complex. He had to fight with patience, with strategy, with mental endurance. Every decision mattered, and every misstep could be fatal. Night fell. The cell grew colder. Shadows deepened, and the distant sound of artillery and gunfire carried faintly across the fields outside. Sleep was impossible. Even the briefest closing of his eyes could mean missing a guard's movement, losing an opportunity, or worse. Daniel sat in silence, listening, waiting. In the darkness, he felt the weight of isolation pressing down, yet also the spark of resolve that had carried him through parachute drops, enemy fire, and landing injuries. Days passed. Daniel was given minimal rations, a thin slab of bread, a cup of lukewarm water, and occasional gruel. He endured the monotony, observing the guards and other prisoners, forming a mental map of the building. He noted the weak locks, the slight looseness of a window latch, the schedules of patrols, and the habits of sentries. Every scrap of knowledge, every pattern noticed, was a tool for survival. He also began to understand the psychology of captivity. Fear could paralyze a man, but defiance could preserve him. He maintained his posture, his gaze, and his refusal to show weakness. Other prisoners began to notice his composure. Some whispered questions. "Are you planning to escape?" Daniel offered nothing but measured nods, letting hope and caution coexist. Leadership, he knew, could be exercised even in chains. One night, during the late hours, Daniel heard footsteps approaching the cell. He stiffened, listening intently. A guard unlocked the door, gesturing him to follow. He was taken to a larger room, dimly lit by a single hanging bulb. A table, a map, and a seated officer awaited him. The officer spoke of interrogation again, of the paratrooper's objectives, of sabotage. Daniel deflected questions with careful, truthful ambiguity, never revealing specifics, yet never provoking the officer's anger. After hours, he was returned to the cell. Exhausted, cold, and hungry, he nonetheless felt a glimmer of opportunity. He now knew routines, weaknesses, and timing. Escape was not a matter of if, but of when, and he began planning with meticulous attention. He examined the walls, the floor, and the door again. Tiny irregularities that had seemed inconsequential now held promise. A loose hinge here, a forgotten bolt there, small clues that could become the key to freedom. As the night deepened, Daniel whispered to himself, a vow made in the darkness. I will not remain a prisoner. I will return to my unit. I will continue the fight. The words became rhythm, a heartbeat against the silence, a constant reminder of purpose. Every day of captivity was a lesson in patience. Every guard rotation calculation, and every shadow a potential ally. By the end of the chapter, Daniel Whitaker had transformed from a captured soldier into a strategist, a prisoner who refused to surrender mentally, preparing himself for the dangerous act that would decide whether he would remain trapped behind enemy lines or reclaim his freedom, and perhaps even turn the tide of the mission he had been sent to complete. The night was thick with mist, the fog rolling low across the field surrounding the camp like a gray, suffocating blanket. Sergeant Daniel Whitaker crouched in the corner of his cell, heart hammering, palms pressed against the cold stone floor. Hours of observation, calculation, and patience had led him to this moment. The guards had grown complacent, their routines predictable, their attention frayed after long days of monotony and night watches. Daniel's plan was simple in concept, but deadly in execution. He would exploit the brief gap between guard rotations, slip out unnoticed, and navigate the perimeter toward the hedgerows that led away from the main compound. The map he had memorized from glimpses during interrogations, combined with mental notes of patrol patterns, gave him a rough course to freedom. Every detail mattered. Every shadow, every sound, every misstep could mean the difference between life and death. The first step was the lock. Daniel had been watching the iron cuffs on his wrists since his capture. He had found a small, imperfect notch in the hinge that no guard had bothered to smooth. With a hairpin improvised from a thin piece of metal scavenged from the cell structure, he worked quietly, listening for the soft shuffle of boots approaching. Minute by minute, the tension coiled tighter, until a faint click echoed in the quiet cell. The cuffs fell away. Freedom, limited but immediate, surged through him. He pressed against the shadowed wall, feeling the uneven texture under his fingers. The door to the cell was thick, reinforced, but he had memorized the weak point. The bolt had a slight gap, and a well-placed shove combined with leverage could lift it. With careful movements, he nudged the door, testing the sound. None. The guard's lantern swayed in the distance, revealing that luck was on his side tonight. Outside the cell, the corridor stretched like a narrow tunnel of danger. Daniel moved silently, crouched low, every breath controlled, every heartbeat measured. He passed the first guard post without incident, slipping into shadows, merging with the mist that hugged the walls. The patrols were infrequent now, the soldiers either overconfident or fatigued from weeks of occupation. This would not last. He had to reach the perimeter quickly. A sudden noise, a boot scraping stone, made him freeze. A young German sentry rounded a corner, lantern in hand, his gaze sweeping methodically. Daniel flattened against the wall, holding his breath as the light passed over him. Seconds stretched into eternity. The guard muttered to himself and moved on. Daniel exhaled slowly, muscles unclenching. The danger was far from over, but he had survived the first test. As he reached the outer door of the compound, the last barrier to the fields beyond, he faced a final obstacle, a small iron grate over a ventilation shaft leading under the wall. Daniel's plan had depended on this. Tight, dark, uncomfortable, but a path out nonetheless. He lifted the grate silently, forcing himself into the narrow passage. The cool earth pressed against him, damp and suffocating. Every movement echoed in his ears, as if amplifying the peril. Hours passed in silence, his body cramped, every inch of movement a negotiation with pain. Dust and dirt filled his lungs, sweat trickled down his back, and every nerve screamed in anticipation of discovery. Yet Daniel forced himself to focus, to calculate, to anticipate each patrol and distant footstep. The mission was not over. Freedom was just a fragile sliver ahead, and he would not falter now. Finally, he emerged from the earth into the hedgerows, the night air sharp against his skin, carrying the faint scent of wet grass and distant gunfire. The camp lay behind him, its walls silhouetted against the faint glow of lamps. He paused to listen. The night was quiet, deceptively so. Far off, he could hear the muffled voices of guards and the occasional bark of a dog. He pressed forward, low and fast, hedgerow after hedgerow, until the camp was a ghost behind him, a memory of terror and captivity. But the path to freedom was far from safe. German patrols crisscrossed the fields, and every shadow could conceal a soldier, a trap, or worse. Daniel moved like a shadow himself, silent, careful, calculating the angles of trees, the low dips in the land, and the sounds of distant artillery. Each step required complete focus, every movement balanced between speed and caution. One mistake, one snap of a twig, one misjudged shadow, and the freedom he had clawed toward would vanish in an instant. Hours later, as the sky began to hint at dawn, Daniel reached a small river, its surface silvered by early light. He paused, taking stock of his condition, bruised, exhausted, yet alive. His mind raced ahead. He needed shelter, allies, information. The escape was only the first part. Survival and reconnection with Allied forces were equally critical. From the undergrowth, he observed a small farm in the distance, smoke rising from the chimney, likely abandoned, but perhaps a source of food or temporary refuge. He moved cautiously, scanning for traps or ambushes. Every instinct screamed caution. Every nerve braced for sudden violence. Yet he also felt a flicker of triumph. He had survived capture, navigated enemy territory, and escaped into the unknown. Hours later, inside the farm, Daniel found minimal supplies: stale bread, a jar of water, a blanket. It was enough to sustain him for the immediate future. He barricaded the door with heavy furniture, listened intently for any sounds pursuit, and allowed himself a brief rest, though sleep was impossible. Every moment he lingered, every pause required vigilance. As night fell again, Daniel planned the next stage of his journey: reconnections with friendly forces, intelligence gathering, and ultimately rejoining his unit loomed ahead. The war was not yet over for him. He had survived the first nightmare, but the larger struggle awaited, and he knew this. The skill, courage, and discipline that had carried him through capture and escape would now define the remainder of his mission. Daniel Whitaker had fallen into enemy hands, faced the darkest uncertainty, and emerged into the shadows of freedom. Yet the path ahead was dangerous, fraught with enemy patrols, uncertain allies, and the constant threat of recapture. Each step would test not only his endurance, but his capacity to remain silent, patient, and vigilant. Every shadow could be friend or foe, every sound a harbinger of danger. But he moved forward, always forward. Dawn bled into horizon with a soft, silver light, painting the hedgerows and fields in muted gray and green. Sergeant Daniel Whitaker emerged from the farm cautiously, every sense alert. The night's escape had been only the first trial. The true danger awaited him in the open fields, patrolled by German soldiers, armored vehicles, and dogs trained to sniff out intruders. One false move here, one misstep, and the relative safety of the farm would vanish like smoke. Daniel crouched low, moving with deliberate care, the soft dew soaking through his boots. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made him freeze. For hours, he traversed the countryside, using hedgerows, shallow ditches, and ruined fences as cover. Each step was calculated, balancing speed and caution, avoiding open spaces where a single glance could reveal him. He paused frequently, listening. The countryside was not empty. Distant gunfire echoed from the advancing front, and occasional shouts carried across the fields. It was during one such pause that Daniel spotted movement in the distance, a small German patrol, rifles at the ready, moving along a dirt road parallel to his path. He flattened himself against the earth, heart pounding, feeling the mud cling to his uniform. The patrol passed within 20 meters. Every instinct screamed to hold still, to remain silent. Minutes stretched like hours. Finally, the patrol disappeared into the misty horizon. Daniel exhaled, but only slightly. He knew this was only the beginning. He moved again, following the line of a low stone wall that bisected the fields. It offered minimal cover, but allowed him to remain partially concealed while advancing toward the nearest village, where he hoped to gather intelligence or at least a safe hiding spot. The sun rose higher, bringing warmth but also visibility. He had to stay in the shadows of trees, crouching, rolling into ditches, and freezing whenever a bird or breeze revealed his movement. By mid-morning, Daniel encountered a small farmhouse partially hidden behind a grove of trees. Smoke curled faintly from its chimney. Cautious, he approached, listening for human activity. Inside, he found a family of villagers, startled by his sudden appearance. They were French, frightened, yet understanding. Through broken English and gestures, they provided him with bread, cheese, and a small container of water. More importantly, they offered guidance. German patrols had been frequent in the area, but a force in the north offered cover for moving toward Allied lines. Daniel stayed barely long enough to replenish his strength, then moved into the trees. The forest was thick and dark, offering concealment but also hazards. Hidden ditches, fallen branches, and the ever-present threat of patrols. He pressed on, moving slowly, methodically, using the sounds of nature to mask his steps. Each crack of a branch beneath his boots felt like a gunshot in his ears. Every shadow seemed to conceal an enemy soldier. Hours passed in tense silence. Daniel navigated using the sun's position, memory of landmarks, and the occasional mark made on a tree to guide his route. Hunger and fatigue gnawed at him, yet he pressed on, knowing that stopping meant vulnerability. The forest thickened, and he slowed even further, relying on instinct and stealth. Movement became a dance of shadows, crouching, pausing, rolling, and advancing only when he was certain no eyes were on him. Late in the afternoon, Daniel heard voices, German soldiers, arguing over the path ahead. He froze, pressed himself into a hollow, and listened. They were speaking in hushed tones, unaware of his presence. One officer mentioned a report of an escaped paratrooper. Daniel's heart raced. They knew someone had slipped the net, but not that he was near. He waited patiently, letting them move away before continuing. Night fell again, the forest deepening into a near impenetrable darkness. Daniel moved only intermittently, hugging the trees and using the terrain to his advantage. At one point, a lone searchlight swept the forest, forcing him to freeze in a shallow depression, holding his breath as the beam passed mere meters above him. The pulse of fear and adrenaline was intoxicating, yet necessary. Every nerve, every muscle, every thought was focused on survival. Finally, after a grueling night, Daniel emerged at the edge of the forest. Before him lay the outskirts of a small Allied reconnaissance zone. He approached cautiously, identifying patrol signs, friendly markers, and safe paths. A pair of scouts spotted him, challenged him, and after a tense moment, recognized him as an American paratrooper. Relief flooded through Daniel as he was escorted to safety, yet he knew the mission was far from complete. He had survived capture, executed an escape, and navigated enemy territory. But the war still raged, and his return to his unit was essential for completing his objective. Daniel's body was battered. Cuts, bruises, and exhaustion etched into every line of his frame. Yet his spirit was unbroken. He had outwitted enemy patrols, endured hunger and fatigue, and relied solely on his training, wit, and determination. This experience had transformed him from a soldier into a survivor, a man who could navigate chaos, danger, and uncertainty with courage and precision. As dawn broke over the horizon, Daniel finally glimpsed the Allied encampment, the tents and sentries a promise of safety and continuity. He allowed himself a brief moment of relief, though vigilance remained. Enemy patrols still roamed nearby, and the war was far from over. Yet for now, Daniel had reclaimed his freedom. The forest, the fields, and the enemy's grasp were behind him. That night, as he lay exhausted yet resolute in the safety of the Allied lines, Daniel reflected on the journey so far. The parachute drop, capture, imprisonment, escape, and perilous trek through enemy territory. Each challenge had tested his courage, endurance, and intellect. Each had forged him further into the paratrooper, who could survive against the odds, a man whose will fight and live refused to be extinguished. Tomorrow, he would rejoin his unit. Tomorrow, he would continue the mission he had been dropped to accomplish. Tonight, he allowed himself only the satisfaction of survival, the knowledge that one man's determination could outlast the machinery, patrols, and strategy of the enemy. The war would continue. Daniel Whitaker had survived the impossible, but the fight was far from over. His story, however, would be a testament to the courage, ingenuity, and sheer will that defines those who operate under the gravest dangers. The first rays of morning crept over the rolling hills, painting the landscape in muted gold. Daniel Whitaker, exhausted but alert, trudged toward the Allied forward outpost, each step heavy with fatigue, yet buoyed by determination. The night had been a blur of adrenaline, shadows, and careful movements. Every muscle in his body ached, every joint protested, but the knowledge that freedom had been reclaimed drove him forward. His mind, however, was sharper than ever, meticulously cataloging the paths, patrols, and risks of the journey just completed. The outpost came into view, a cluster of canvas tents, makeshift barricades, and sentries patrolling in the crisp morning air. The sounds of routine, a distant shout, the metallic clatter of equipment, the low murmur of men planning operations, struck Daniel as both foreign and comforting. Here, he was among allies. Here, survival meant more than avoiding capture. It meant preparing for the fight that still raged across Europe. 2 sentries spotted him first. Their voices cut to the morning air, sharp and questioning. Daniel lifted his hand slowly, cautious of misunderstanding, and identified himself. Sergeant Daniel Whitaker, 82nd Airborne, he said, voice hoarse from dehydration and exertion. The sentry studied him for a tense moment, eyes scanning for weapon signs of injury or deception. Recognition flickered, and one of them ran toward the commanding tent to alert the officers. Inside the command tent, Daniel was greeted by Major Thompson, a stocky man with a weathered face etched by years of war. Thompson's eyes widened briefly, registering disbelief and relief. "Whitaker, you made it!" The words carried both astonishment and admiration. Daniel simply nodded, the weight of his ordeal still pressing down, and began recounting his story, carefully and deliberately. Every detail mattered. The capture, the cell, the guards, the routines, the escape, the trek through enemy territory. As he spoke, Thompson listened intently, occasionally interrupting to ask questions or clarify details. Daniel's account was not just a tale of survival, it was intelligence. Knowledge of enemy patrols, terrain, and vulnerabilities could aid the Allied forces in upcoming operations. Every observation he had made during captivity and escape was now a weapon in the ongoing conflict. The Major's expression shifted from disbelief to grave calculation as the implications sank in. After the debriefing, Daniel was given food, water, and a chance to rest. The rations were simple bread, hard cheese, and a thin stew, but they were enough to sustain him. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, mindful of the need to restore strength while remaining alert. Sleep, however, eluded him. The memory of cold stone floors, the clink of iron cuffs, the threat of discovery, and the ever-present shadow of enemy forces lingered in his mind. He closed his eyes briefly, only to see the faces of the German guards, the misty fields, and the distant flashes of gunfire. By afternoon, Daniel felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was physically exhausted, yes, but mentally resolute. Returning to his unit was not simply a personal goal. It was essential for the mission. Orders awaited, reinforcements were planned, and a larger operation depended on every man being in place. He moved through the camp with careful attention, observing communications, troop movements, and logistical operations. Even in a moment of reprieve, a soldier's mind never truly rests. The reunion with his comrades was bittersweet. Some had feared he was lost forever. Others had assumed the worst. Their reactions were raw, marked by relief, disbelief, and quiet celebration. Brief handshakes, firm slaps on the back, and silent nods conveyed what words could not. Each gesture reinforced a bond forged in combat, a bond strengthened by the shared understanding of risk, courage, and sacrifice. Even as he settled briefly among the familiar faces of the 82nd Airborne, Daniel remained vigilant. He debriefed with fellow soldiers, exchanged intelligence, and shared observations gleaned during captivity. His escape had provided unique insights into enemy routines and weaknesses, information that could be leveraged for upcoming operations. The paratrooper who had fallen into enemy hands had returned not just alive, but as a more valuable asset, a man tempered by adversity. Night approached again, and with it, the quiet moments before another mission. Daniel took stock of his gear, checking weapons, ammunition, and equipment. Every detail was critical. Even in the calm of the outpost, the shadow of danger loomed. The Germans were not idle, and every intelligence point, every tactical observation could influence the next engagement. In the tent, as the night deepened and the outpost settled into a fragile calm, Daniel reflected on the journey from the jump behind enemy lines, through capture and into freedom. Each challenge, the parachute drop, the imprisonment, the escape, and the trek through hostile territory, had tested his endurance, courage, and mental acuity. Yet he had survived. More than that, he had returned with knowledge, experience, and an indomitable will. Major Thompson approached, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You've done more than survive, Whitaker. You've turned a disaster into an advantage. Your unit, your mission, and your country are fortunate to have you back." Daniel nodded silently, acknowledging the weight of responsibility. The war was far from over, and the next mission would demand all of his skill and courage. As he lay down briefly, Daniel allowed himself a fleeting moment of rest. Exhaustion pulled at his body, but his mind remained alert, replaying every step of his escape, every sound, every observation. In the darkness of the tent, he vowed silently to continue fighting, to honor those who could not escape, and to leverage every lesson learned to save lives and accomplish the mission. The night passed uneventfully, a fragile reprieve before the storm of action that would inevitably follow. By dawn, Daniel Whitaker would rise once more, a paratrooper who had faced capture, endured, escaped, and returned to the fold, a living testament to courage, strategy, and unyielding determination. The morning sun cast long shadows across the camp as Daniel Whitaker prepared to move out with his unit. The previous days had been a blur of exhaustion, debriefings, and recovery, but now the focus shifted squarely to the mission ahead. Intelligence gathered during his imprisonment and perilous escape had provided valuable insight into enemy patrols, movements, and weak points. The unit would leverage that knowledge to execute operations that could save lives and turn the tide in localized engagements. Daniel stood silently near the edge of the encampment, inspecting his equipment. Every weapon, every strap, every pack was checked meticulously. Even minor oversights in the field could prove deadly, and he had no intention of allowing fatigue or carelessness to compromise the mission. The past weeks had taught him to value every decision, every calculation, and every moment of vigilance. He was no longer just a paratrooper. He was a survivor with a refined sense of strategy born from direct confrontation with life and death. The unit gathered for a briefing. Maps were spread across a makeshift table, officers pointing out German positions, patrol routes, and vulnerable checkpoints. Daniel's observations were detailed, precise, and immediately actionable. His account of the terrain, patrol routines, and likely points of engagement allowed the officers to adjust plans with unprecedented accuracy. Men around him listened with rapt attention, their morale bolstered by the knowledge that someone among them had endured the enemy's grasp and returned with critical information. The operation began at first light. Daniel's unit moved cautiously through forested terrain, skirting open fields and avoiding enemy checkpoints. His mind remained focused, scanning for threats, noting subtle changes in the environment, and anticipating potential ambushes. Every footstep was calculated, every breath controlled, every motion deliberate. The stakes were high, the mission was critical, the enemy alert, and any misstep could result in casualties. During the approach to the target zone, Daniel spotted a German patrol advancing along a narrow dirt path. He signaled his squad to halt, pointing to the patrol's position. Using hand gestures and silent cues, he guided his men along a concealed route, allowing them to avoid detection while positioning for a tactical advantage. When the patrol passed, they moved silently, avoiding the watchful eyes of the enemy and exploiting the terrain to maintain the element of surprise. By midday, they reached the outskirts of a small village under German control. Daniel's prior knowledge of enemy routines proved invaluable. Patrol rotations, sentry positions, and the timing of supply deliveries allowed the unit to maneuver with precision. Under his guidance, they secured the area, neutralized resistance with minimal confrontation, and established a foothold for further operations. Every success, however small, was hard-won and heavily reliant on the intelligence Daniel had risked everything to obtain. The mission culminated in the capture of a strategic communications post. Daniel and a small team infiltrated the position under cover darkness, using stealth to their advantage. Every movement was deliberate, every breath held. The enemy inside was unaware of the threat until it was too late. Within moments, the post was under Allied control, enemy communications disrupted, and critical intelligence seized. The operation was a testament to planning, courage, and the hard-earned knowledge Daniel had brought from captivity. As the unit consolidated its position, Daniel finally allowed himself a brief moment to reflect. He had survived the initial drop behind enemy lines, endured capture, executed a harrowing escape, and returned to contribute meaningfully to the mission. The courage and resourcefulness he had displayed were extraordinary, yet he understood that every soldier's contribution, whether on the front lines, behind enemy lines, or in support, was vital to the collective effort. Even as they celebrated their success, Daniel's thoughts turned to the men still in enemy hands. The relief of the mission's success was tempered by the awareness that others faced trials similar to his own. The war demanded courage in many forms, and every act of bravery, seen or unseen, shaped the outcome of the larger struggle. By evening, the unit was ordered to withdraw to a safe position behind the front lines. Daniel moved with them, exhausted but resolute. His body ached from days of continuous exertion, his muscles heavy with fatigue. Yet his spirit remained unbroken. He had confronted fear, uncertainty, and danger at every turn, and each confrontation had strengthened him. Back at the forward outpost, Daniel received a formal commendation from his commanding officer. The citation recognized not only his bravery during capture and escape, but also the critical intelligence he had provided and his pivotal role in the success of the mission. Standing amidst his comrades, Daniel felt a quiet pride, not from recognition, but from the knowledge that it endured, survived, and made a tangible difference. Night fell once more over the camp, a fragile quiet after the storm of action. Daniel sat by a small fire, gazing at the stars. The world beyond the battlefield felt distant yet vital. He thought of those who had not survived, those still trapped behind enemy lines, and the countless acts of courage that went unnoticed each day. His journey had been extraordinary, but it was only one thread in the vast tapestry of war. As he lay down to rest, Daniel's mind replayed every challenge he had faced. The parachute drop, the capture, the harsh conditions of imprisonment, the perilous escape, and the decisive actions that had contributed to the mission's success. Each memory was a reminder of the resilience, ingenuity, and courage required to survive and fight in the most extreme circumstances. Daniel Whitaker had fallen into enemy hands, faced the full weight of fear and uncertainty, and emerged stronger, wiser, and resolute. His story would endure, not only as a testament to his personal bravery, but as an example of the unyielding spirit of those who fight against overwhelming odds. The paratrooper who had been captured had returned, not just to survive, but to make a difference, leaving an indelible mark on the mission, his comrades, and the course of the war.